So thank you all. We'll start with the breakout reports. And I think we probably should start with the joint fund and the joint fundraising as the two sort of the voting-wise top winners from yesterday. I'm actually going to start, Chris, I think, with you on the joint fundraising, because I think that'll answer some questions more as we move to the joint fund piece. So over to you.
So we had a very lively discussion and took up all the time, which was good. And, I think people saw a lot of promise in this particular model. There is some overlap, as Phil had said, with joint fund and joint funding and some confusion still in how this is done. But one of the people on our group, I think, put it well and said, this is sort of a family of brands. It's a fund with a family of brands. Now, how that family hangs together, how you define who that family's in, who's out, how you distinguish between them, I think is some of the challenges that we identified. But and I think this will be clear across all these different areas. I'll go through the little matrix that Phil wrote. The key stakeholders for development, I think folks thought you had to have people who had been at this meeting, but also people outside of this meeting. Ideally, if you're going to create something that is United Way-esque, you want to have, maybe talk to people from the United Way. You want to have people from NetHope who are here, who have a similar structure. Can you bring in some of that expertise, bring in some funder expertise to have really a kind of group that would think through this? And part of that is also, even at that beginning stage, is to have a code of conduct, have a mission statement of what this is trying to solve, and also how you present this. What's the business case? In other words, what's your pitch you're going to make that's going to make it exciting for people to want to contribute to this fund? And I think that requires a lot more thought. This proposal, and I expect the joint fund to, it's going to take a while to get this off the ground. We had to have more than a 90-minute foundational discussion on this that we had today, as rich as that was. The incentive for funders is pretty clear. I mean that, outside, some funders have very specific things they want to advance, and some governments have, particular structures that they want to advance. But a lot of people just want to help. They see the cybersecurity problem. We've come up with the narrative, this group certainly, of why this is an important area. But, if funders can say, look, I don't know where to put my money. I don't even know the full panoply of all the things that people are doing in this conference, for instance. If I can give to one group that I can say, I'm making an impact, I'm doing good, that's tremendously seductive if you do it right. And that's the hard thing, is doing it right, but making sure that they have that impact. So impact and being able to do something and not have to decide how you're going to allocate your money, I think funders would like. Now, the barriers and challenges are not insignificant. And I joked a little bit, as a recovering lawyer, I'm good at identifying challenges and not so much solutions sometimes. But so there were a lot of challenges, and one of them, one key one is, how do you divide the pie? In the read ahead, it sort of glibly, says that you'll have an MOU and you'll decide among yourselves how it gets divided up. Good luck with that. That's not easy. Because you are choosing among your children, even the people the groups who participate in this kind of joint funding effort and who will go out and advocate for this. They all want money. So how do you make the division? How do you make the decision? This ties into the governance model. How can you actually do that in a good way? And that's probably the biggest challenge, although there are other challenges too, like building trust. United Way people trust the United Way, even though it's had some problems in the past. People trust the United Way, and they say, okay, we'll give money to that because we trust it. We trust their structure. You can't just create an organization and have trust right away. You have to build that trust in the organization. And that also goes to governance. Do you have a governance board that's more luminary type? Do you have some people that people are like, oh, they're associated with it, I trust this organization? And I imagine this is going to be true for some of the joint funds issues too. So that equitable distribution, building trust, and also dealing with things like government bureaucracy. Do we want governments to contribute to this? Well, as you know, governments have grant-making cycles and all these things. Even organizations have grant-making cycles. And they like those cycles. They've done this for 30, 40 years. And you're telling them just give money to an organization to divide? How do they have accountability? How do they deal with that? So those are all key challenges. The key stakeholders in operation are similar to the key stakeholders in development, but one of the things, and this is also what you want in development, there are organizations that do this now, not just NetHope and United Way. There are smaller organizations that do kind of administrative back end, get some of those involved too. I think that's important. Governance, as I said, a big thing. The number one thing people said is there has to be trust and transparency. And when you have trust and transparency, that means you have to have clear mission statements, clear governance models, clear charters, clear ethics statements, transparency. Those are all critically important. For this to be sustainable, it actually has to succeed, right? It actually has to show that it's making the pie larger. The whole idea behind this is not to take the existing pie and carve it up a different way. It's to substantially increase the pie that's out there. And for that to succeed, you might have to make sure that that is going forward. And part of that is storytelling. And this is the other advantage of this model. If we all agree we need to be better at storytelling, if you can have an organization that could tell a compelling story and also tell a story along the way, well, with this funding, we were able to have this impact. That, I think, makes it more sustainable. Next steps, as I said, you need to really get a group together to have a longer conversation about this. You have to do things like drafting potential mission statements and charters and bylaws. Several people, you'll be happy to know, in the group volunteered to help with that. And so our note taker took that down. Also in messaging and how you craft that message, why this is important. Ultimately, we do think this has a high value in helping solve this issue, but it's not an easy lift. It's going to take a long time to establish this and to make sure it's working, and it doesn't, as someone said, detract from what we're trying to achieve, but it actually helps with what we're trying to achieve. And I missed a lot of nuance and other things in the room, but I told all my folks that when we get to the discussion point, they should be more than free to jump in.
Thanks, Chris. That's super helpful. I think that you raised a really interesting point that, in some sense, I'm differentiating here between joint fundraising and joint fund model. Right? The joint fundraising, the joint fund actually requires a governance model for who gets money. The joint fundraising may be harder because there isn't, it's by contractor agreement, at least notionally.
Yeah, but that's the point. How do you get there? And someone also raised a really interesting threshold point. In United Way, you get to designate where your funds go. You get to choose among the list. Is that part of this model? Or is it a combination one? And one of the challenges is if you start using this device to fundraise, how does that affect your ability to fundraise separately? So, yeah. Which again, I think is common to others.
Absolutely true. So let's open up to questions, comments, thoughts from the panel up here for Chris on the overall issue of sort of the joint fundraising comment.
Chris, you did my readout.
Well, why don't we go to Lauren next, and then we'll talk more generally about both options after Lauren talks about the joint fund model. So Lauren?
Okay, bear with me. My brain doesn't compute information as quickly, so I'm just going to review what we talked about and try to hit the key moments. But I think generally aligned with what Chris said is any type of joint fund would need a clearly defined mission, one that accounts for agility, but also focus, and I think ultimately something that is stable, right? Something that provides stability for the stakeholders, which include all of the folks in this room, but also civil society, the public. One of the values of such a fund could be providing for due diligence for foundations and other donors, so taking some of that heavy lift of having to vet the good work that many nonprofits do and be able to provide that sort of guidance to potential funders, including foundations, and essentially qualify them. And we talked about, I think it's, my brain is, hormones are flying. CAF, it's essentially a vetting, thank you. It's a vetting thank you. It's a vetting organization that sort of essentially does that. It reviews nonprofits, it qualifies them, and then it promotes them to different types of funders, so that's something to look at. I think we sort of tracked what you were saying, Chris, about requiring transparency and accountability and oversight for any type of joint fund. But also with respect to deciding who is at the table, if it's corporations or government, what type of incentive or interest will they have, and what type of influence might their seat at the table have on how funds are distributed. So having a clearly defined set of principles to sort of govern that decision-making process. There were quite a few great models noted, and it sounds like you're going to capture all of this, fill in it, but Open Tech was one, correct, Matt? And there was also the 1% plan. Where are you? Yes, what was it, 1%? for the planet. So we have a couple of effective models that we can capture in the notes. Everyone also noted the need for a champion, and I think this is where there was an important conversation in our group around equity. So a lot of the times the missing narrative are the people harmed by technology, and so how do we strike that sort of important balance between lifting up those narratives to hopefully inspire broad-based public support for a fund like this, while also not essentially being predatory with respect to how we leverage some of those really key narratives in this workspace. And then I know I'm missing things because I am looking at my notes that I can't read. But they're all there, Phil, I'm just telling you. Some of the barriers and challenges, again, sort of clearly defining the end goals and how we get there, defining and vetting who's at the table, understanding that cybersecurity is so diffusive. Again, I think that's what was sort of unique. We were using the sort of comparative case study of AIDS and sort of how it was, I wouldn't say easy to attract public support for something like that, but how cybersecurity is sort of, someone said, boiling the ocean. So again, trying to strike that really sensitive balance between like focus and also stability. And then someone had a great idea about maybe starting with a more seeded, focused project that could build momentum for a joint fund, and I think it was Sophie who mentioned hospitals, sort of given that's a vulnerable population that's been talked about, is maybe it's piloting the concept for this behind a theme or a vulnerability point that we know the public will understand and have felt. And my this is a really key point, the impact of geopolitics on all of this, and sort of the sensitive nature of shifting geopolitics around the work. And again, with respect to who can actually play in the pool or contribute to the pool, being sensitive of changing geopolitical situations and how that might actually influence or shape perceptions around the fund itself. And then also a role for small funders. So this could actually be a space to bring in some of the sort of more well-established large funders, but also create an opportunity and incentive for small funders to contribute to something that can have a broad-based impact as well. And then I think it is like looking to the communities, I'm gonna put in my own little bias here, which is I think something like this could be intergenerational. So seeding, things that are actually occurring locally on the ground, especially among youth who are doing really cool dynamic things in tech, and actually fostering a dynamic ecosystem that lifts up youth populations as part of cybersecurity, because I think we all concede it's a dynamic environment that has intergenerational impacts. And if it's just all older-ish old people in a room or really well-established nonprofit organizations, it might not have the sustainable impact that we hope. And that can include like mentorship as well. And then I see Tony, and I'm making eyes at you, Tony, for this reason, which is we talked a lot about it, a fund could be it could be financial, but there could also be a space for shared just information, tools, resources, might need some IP guidance there, Chris, but sure you can figure it out. But how do we also create other aspects of this joint fund that would benefit and incentivize people to participate? And I know I'm missing a lot of other things, but that's the high readout.
Good, Kiersten.
So I know over the last day and a half we've sort of touched on a couple of these different aspects, but I'm trying to figure out, as we've had these conversations, is there a differentiator with this topic of cybersecurity that makes some of the models that we're talking about as best practices something that we've got to look at a little bit more closely? Certainly we have to work off of best practices and what's worked and what hasn't worked. But the challenge that we have is that what we're asking, and I think the premise, Phil, of looking at this conversation is we're filling a gap in national security. And when we look at the role of nonprofits, we certainly see it with climate security, we see it with health security, but there is a disconnect on what impacts people. So when the analogy like to AIDS and other things, people really feel that. They feel their community suffering with climate, with health issues, but we still struggle with the impact of cyber as a national security issue. And so when we look at like the joint funding, I'm just curious, and Eli, I don't know maybe if you could talk to this based on the Hewlett piece, the funders come in I'm not talking about the large foundations, but when you look at the current that's been created by individuals who said, we have a national security need that needs to be addressed urgently, I'm going to step in with this. And I know that that's typically the case in other areas, but can we ask them to collaborate in this way effectively because of the national security piece, but also because of the urgency? And Eli, with Hewlett, when you were, you kind of have this hybrid because it's an established foundation, but a new effort. When you look at this kind of let's all come together, do you think that that's feasible in this space because of the differentiation across privacy, technology, data integrity, all of these elements that create complexities to unifying under one roof?
Yeah, no, and first of all, thanks for having me, Phil, and everybody who pulled this together, and it's great to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience, and sorry I couldn't join yesterday. It's a hard question to answer, Kiersten, for some of the reasons I think Chris and Lauren identified. And one is that the funding landscape is just incredibly inefficient and just fragmented. And it's always been that way, and I think that's the norm, right? Like there are deviations from that when there is a shared crisis that can engender sort of rapid collaboration and collective action, but then it typically reverts to, well, we're all different, we have different interests, we care about different communities. I call it national security, you call it personal security, digital versus cyber, all the different words, sometimes those distinctions matter, sometimes they don't. And so I think it's a really good question, and to date, I would say we haven't been able to sort of marshal that case at scale. I think there are examples where major philanthropies and individuals, some of whom are in the room and out of the room, have stepped up. But given how diffuse it is, there are stories, unfortunately, more and more in the press about hospitals being ransomed and people being impacted medically as a result. And then other cases of perhaps critical infrastructure failing that lead to death or harm. But unfortunately, that hasn't galvanized the action. And so one of the challenges I think about when I think about collective fundraising and a joint fund is, how do you get enough money to start it so that it's worth it? And then that in turn builds momentum and attracts others. And given the scale of the need, you're talking a 10 million, 8-figure sum of money, some multiple of that, to make the juice worth the squeeze, frankly, for all the nonprofits. And so who will step up and lead and then get more and more? And I think I can see the wisdom in a targeted trial to say, let's orient around something more narrowly defined, but then that's going to exclude some by definition. And so I think what probably is going to need to happen is a little bit of experimentation along a couple different tracks. But I can say one of the big frustrations at Hewlett was trying to get others to recognize the need to step up and really prioritize this. Given there is a real human harm and dimension, but then how do you tell the story? A lot of the things that the folks have gotten into. So I wish I had a better answer and a silver bullet, but I do think that we're slowly evolving, more people are interested, and there are lots of pieces of the answer here in the audience and on stage.
Yeah,
Lauren, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, at least from Girls Security's perspective, we survey girls and women about national security, and they don't connect with it because it's the military and the intelligence community. And so I think that's a whole nother around equity and just the work in that space, but I think we have to make this work reflect the impacts that it's having on the communities that are harmed, who also don't see themselves in this room among these people. And that's a lot more work than, one fund can accomplish, I think.
I think one of the people in our group has a marketing background and said that, part of this is, if you create a fund that, part of the challenges, as Eli said, is that people are not galvanized enough by this issue. But also part of it is people look at it as a very complex issue and don't know where to begin. So if you do have a conglomeration like this, whether it be a joint fund or a joint, a federated United Way type fund, that allows people to say, okay, I'm not sure where to put my money, but I know if I put it in this group, we could have more of an impact, and they understand there's a big problem, they're scared of it, they don't know what it is exactly. And so that helps, it's sort of the similar situation of vendors who are trying to sell cybersecurity, and you go to the RSA conference and you go to the show floor and you have no idea what to do. It's the same idea a bit. It's not the only reason it's a barrier, but that could help. But part of it is also to tell that compelling story within this group that's now leveraged a lot of different organizations.
And I think part of it is also, and this is also improved, I mean, going back to sort of, Michael, when you were in the White House and calling on philanthropy and individuals to step up and to empower them and say, we in government, and Kiersten did this and others, it is like, government is not going to solve this for everybody, nor is the private sector. It is an all of society, all of world approach, right? And that is just complicated, and it does require messaging and stories and trying to identify who has what role. And I think that while there are strategies and plans issued by different entities, there's none of those that's really like fully agreed upon, and everyone's like, oh, I get it. I get where I fit into this as an individual who hasn't served in government and doesn't work at Google, Microsoft, Cisco, whatever, right? And so I think that falls to philanthropy too, to realize sort of both that you need to identify where do you sit, how do you contribute, and it also falls on those who people more innately turn to, which is government and the private sector, to solve these problems and say like, this is a more clear articulation of how we're going to partner with you, those people with money and who want to make the world a better place and help impact people, and make it simpler, cleaner, easier to do that. And that has also been an educational learning process that has taken years to get to the point where, if you look at different strategies now coming, it very clearly articulates a role for civil society, a role for funders. Like, that has not always been the case. And so I think that's been a natural evolution, and we're still very much in the midst of that.
And I just want to build off of something that Eli said, because I think this is important. In your group, I believe it was Tony that was talking about we can't awareness ourselves out of the problem. And I think that it doesn't have to be an either or, because I think what, Eli, the framework that you've put forward, it's like we've got to be able to help everybody understand. And yesterday, Craig talked about, I think he said all of country approach, which is how do we message about the individual accountability and responsibility while also simultaneously taking these efforts of these organizations that are addressing these issues that are technical or otherwise, but they have to happen at the same time. And it was interesting because Tony's point and your point, I feel like sort of puts that into a framework that these don't have to be choices, that we actually have to have an interdisciplinary, multifaceted approach where entities and organizations might emphasize one over the other, but that they have to be happening at the same time, because the true success, and I think in one of the other groups somebody talked about we need to be working ourselves out of a job, like the true success is getting Josh and others, because I think I heard in a couple of groups, the true success happens with that destination of what have we achieved? And that has to happen, I think, with that interdisciplinary approach around education and the actual work and mission.
And I say this because it's coming up, in our group, one of the people who was there does cyber awareness campaigns and was saying, look, Cyber Awareness Month, et cetera. It was like,
I
look,
just came from CISA,
you may not be able to awareness yourself out, but awareness is a key part of this narrative, because that's what's going to drive the kind of engagement that you need, and you have to do it in a smart way.
And I think it's a component, because I think,
Yeah,
we just thinking about what we just did with Secure Our World and all of this, and multi-factor authentication more than a password, that has to happen in conjunction with the work, because you've got to understand, everyone always says you don't need to know the how, you just need to know the why. But I think that, or vice versa, you don't need to know the why, you just need to know the how. But I think we've got to push this forward to do both around the education and the work, so that there's greater, and I used this word yesterday, and it, was not, literacy and fluency, not in the actual communities, but to have a greater understanding and complexity to move the ball.
And there's no replacement, I think, to the point about trust. It's not just trust in the fund, it's who's the messenger. Because CISA campaigns aren't reaching teenagers, or
in Safeway? Because I heard it in Safeway like 2 weeks ago.
I think there's a space for who should be doing what,
Absolutely.
in what communities, and what demographic, and so I think that's where it needs to be. There's no replacement for community-based, localized relationships and building that trust around these messages. And I think that seems to be a tension in some spaces where we need to clearly define those parameters around who should be doing what and with whom, and who is most qualified from a trust perspective to be doing that work.
And what the narrative is, right? Because different narratives are going to resonate in different communities, and it's the outcome we want to get to.
Yeah,
Couple
regardless
of quick, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, part of that is what we talked about this in our group too, that there's a wide variety of capabilities in this room, right? And among organizations generally. So, one attraction to this might be that a donor wants to give money to either a fund or a federated fund, and you can match it. You could say, we can put together a solution that hits all these different parts of the awareness part, the policy part, the technical part, that they can't do alone. That it's sort of a force multiplier in that. And that helps drive the awareness story and impact. And it should be kind of a loop so that if we succeed in this, we can demonstrate that impact, and that helps with the awareness too. But
So a couple of quick questions, and then we'll go on to the next model. One is, we've been spending a fair amount of time here talking about on the notion of incentives. And I think Eli is very well taken that there's sort of a, it has to be big enough to matter, right? Because otherwise, it's like kind of what, Ron Gula said yesterday, where it's like, most of these organizations are too small for me to worry about sustainability, right? It's too diverse a space in that sense. And so you need enough of an oomph so that people pay attention and governments take it seriously. What do you think, does anybody have anything to add? We've talked about it a fair amount, but in terms of actually building the incentives so people would want to contribute to joint fundraising or a joint fund in this space, as was suggested before, as Kiersten was saying, this is, it's not like, global hunger, right? You don't have starving people to show to everyone, and cyber isn't understood. So, and companies and governments like to give to a thing and not to an issue. So first question is there anything else we want to add about having federated or joint giving and trying to incentivize that, recognizing that we need to be much better at storytelling and have the business case, which we'll get to in a second. Stéphane?
The point we discussed about this morning is for logical reason, the discussion is quite US-centric. It's important to understand what's happening in the other part of the world. For example, the EU in this. If you would go with this narrative in the EU and explaining that we need to have a joint fund in order to help civil society, one of the first feedback you'll get from the Commission is that it exists. It's there. We've solved it. So what do you want? And it's very important to navigate this narrative because it doesn't exist, obviously. But the fact that people really think it does, and they spend their whole day working on something that they feel is something that you need to navigate when you want to attract them to a joint venture. And I think then the scope of the venture is important. If you think about countries, you think about foundation, you think about entities, who do you invite? How do you define like-minded? Because you cannot do this something really like globally. It's not feasible, especially in the geopolitics as you were mentioning.
So the other thing I want to dive into really quickly before we go to the next model is the point both Chris and Lauren raised about trust and transparency, right? Sort of in terms of next steps, right, and building governance models, anything that you want to share from the groups that talked about how you would actually start to move forward in this way, in a way that did generate trust, that did not, look, we've all been involved in this. InfoSec is full of drama. And there's just more drama than you can shake a stick at. And we need less drama, right? How do we avoid some of the drama, the black helicopters, try and move forward in a way that, is consensus building, recognizing that winners and losers are going to get picked?
So I think there's a reality that, so there's a process question, right? Which is how do you design it? How do you get the fund going? How is it governed? And I think there are lots of interesting models that folks have invoked, many of which are relevant, and you could come up with that plan, and I think that's worthwhile. I think at the same time, though, part of that model is going to be influenced by who's putting in the money, just to be totally honest. And that's both problematic and sort of the reality, right? And so part of it is going to be determined, or at least influenced, I would argue, by who is going to anchor this. And to Stéphane's point, if you're going to say well, there's going to be a robust Europe nexus here because the EC is going to put in a lot of money or different foundations in Europe, they have a materially different way of doing things than say a major US-based nonprofit funder that is then going to go to influence the design questions. And so it's a bit of a chicken and egg question, and I think what may be best is you think about who is the short list of who could conceivably seed fund this. And so there are visionary, generous people like Craig and others who realistically I think are the best bet. There are some government and multi-government funding entities that could be, frankly, more in Europe than in the US, I would argue. And so you may even want to think about here are a couple different models, 2 to 3, and here are 2 to 3 different who are the most likely funders, and then those will align. But I worry that if there's sort of one optimal design, that is not going to align with who puts in the money and what they want, and you're going to have to balance that because they should not dictate it. They should not have too much influence. It should not be unrepresentative, but like there are going to be trade-offs, I guess, is sort of.
So we talked about this, and I totally agree with what Eli said, but I'd add also, is there a structure like a board of trustees or something of people who are recognizable and trustworthy that lend their reputation essentially to this? And that, sometimes that's seen as an appearance thing, but I think it really does generate more, okay, well, these guys wind up in favor of this, that must be something that is valid, has trust. And it's coupled with what you said about who puts the money in too, and you also have to demonstrate that two people aren't driving all the resource allocations, because then that suspicion, that black helicopter, all that stuff comes from that.
Right. Look, and we spent a lot of time talking about this from both perspectives, right? The excuse me, how we get the experience that the current nonprofits have with governance today, and what has worked and hasn't worked, and how that can also shape the conversation about governance, in as much as the funders shape that conversation. And so we spent a little bit of time sort of brainstorming, would it make sense, or how could we just collect everybody's experience in this space, be transparent about that, and then have the development of the governance activity be equally transparent as the execution.
So let's use that as a transition, actually. It's a very good transition to the breakout on the business case, data, narrative. So Bobbie, that's the underlying data source for everything we're talking about, including the two programs, right? How did you guys solve the problem? What do we need to get done? And please tell us.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, we worked right up until the point in time you gave us the hook, and we weren't quite done. I would say, it's really interesting because a phenomenal amount of passion in the room. So I just want to thank everybody who sat in that room, and we heard, I think, from almost everyone, which is in a session like that is hard to say. So I really, really appreciate it, and I will do a poor job reflecting it back, and so please correct me as you go. So we absolutely agree with the idea of narrative, but narratives is the more important way to think about it. And really, if we think that a single message, a single voice, a single way of describing the situation for both getting funding and for moving the ball works, we all know that not to be the case. So we need to really understand and recognize that we have to do that. But we do think that we did spend a little bit of time thinking about the fact that a sort of a single aligned statement of value and of outcome is a useful thing, and really necessary and important, right? What's the mission, what's the vision, what does that look like, and how can we make that as crisp and clear as possible, such that it can be sort of the rallying that everything can level under. We had a couple of proposals in the room, but we really thought that was, an important sort of early step that needed to happen. We thankfully avoided a deep conversation about metrics and what exists and what didn't exist, with a recognition that anecdotes are going to be important, and greater quantitativeness is going to have to be recognized. One of the, I think, most meaningful observations was one that came forward, that perhaps the commentary that we have that's about technology and technological improvement is really not where, in many instances, some of the funders are focused on, right? They want an assertion of a theory of the case and a set of actions that would, here's your theory of the case, here's how you would determine that what you're doing is making a difference, and then here are the set of actions that are underneath it, which I think opens up the narrative opportunity for us in a much more impactful way than when we get really narrow into a particular technology mechanism. We did not, but almost went down the rabbit hole of quantification of harms. We all agree that's an important piece of it, but we have to figure out how we do that in ways that resonate with there. And the business case that we're all want to start with is, you should want to fund us because, and that you shouldn't start with that, right? That there's no value in that statement. So alignment was there. I think one of the Gordian knots that we did not untie is the sort of 3x3 dimension of stakeholders as we sort of do stakeholder mapping. That's important. The first one is that we have, sort of good overlap and misalignment between the people who receive the value, who are different than the people who oftentimes do the implementation, who are different than the people who fund. And we need all three, but we have that sort of misalignment. And that's one three-way dimension that gets on top of the things that the implementers sort of fall into the category of hunters of problems that need to get solved, that are there, people who are tracking what's emerging and can produce a set of solutions around the emerging set of things to keep it from being too big. And then a bunch of stuff that is really not sexy and difficult to get funding, which is the stuff that just needs to be sustained. But without that situation, that becomes a problem. And we have a co-evolving and sometimes healthy, sometimes not healthy relationship between governments and the private sector. And I use governments broadly because it's not just the U.S. government and it's not just federal governments, but they're funders, they're value recipients, they're implementers in all three of those ways, and really being able to have an entrance point that speaks to all of those roles and moves you forward is both important from a getting funding and an execution of the fund and other pieces. So what I would say is we spent more time, we have a good understanding of the problem, which is, I think, better than we had when we walked into the room. We had a long conversation about sort of where to start, and one of the things that we think, I think we said was that acknowledging core structural weaknesses that keep us from doing anything but spinning is going to have to be a part of the plan. And some of those structural weaknesses are, certainly metrics, but an observation that I'm still sort of rattling around in my brain was that if you compare what we have relative to a bunch of the work in the climate world, and forgive me if I've gotten this wrong, this was your observation, that there's an awful lot we can learn from how nonprofits as consortiums are tackling some of the climate issues. But it sort of hurts my heart to say this, but that we do a bad job information sharing compared to them. And given how many decades we've all been doing information sharing, this comment sort of hurts my heart a little bit. But part of that reason is because of some of these structural challenges we have relative to nonprofits, governments, and industry. And I think Michael's example of two companies in the same day having divergently.
Remember, we're Chatham House rules in the break.
Oh, excuse me. Someone's comment about two. Okay, thank you. He said it yesterday, so the whole audience heard it. Got it. But the two companies in the same day making 180-degree observations about the state of ransomware. Just sort of even belief of the data is lacking in many instances, which is sort of one of those structural issues that were there. Having said all of that, as we define that sort of single aligned statement and a set of first principles, that's sort of where do we start? What is that single aligned statement? What are those first principles around governing that we need to put forward? What are the attributes of governance, both looking at it from the outside and looking at it from the inside, are all sort of important elements in that business case. And we cannot take our eye off the ball of the fact that operational capacity of the organization has to be an important thing, right? If you can't keep the lights on, either because of, for a variety of reasons, that doesn't move the ball.
Yep. Agreed. No, that's super interesting. First question I think I've got, and we can move relatively quickly and then talk about that and the accelerator model at the same time if people don't have specific comments. Did you talk about next steps? Like what's the get going here?
Yeah, we actually, we talked a bunch about that in a variety of different ways. The first one was we a really good observation that we should scan existing governance activities, right? Learn and talk about what's working and what isn't amongst them. That there was a feeling that we needed more information about that. We had ideas, but not enough sort of clarity on which thing was right versus not right. The statement, right? What was that single aligned statement? We had a couple of ideas in the room. Was the next first step, and then the collection of historical things that have worked, right? Particularly when it has come to gaining, to talking with largely private sector entities, but talking with them about sort of the relative interdependent roles that needed to exist and what was successful, how to move those from a conversation about just the problem to action. Really involved a deeper understanding. There was an example from one of the members that really involved getting a deeper understanding of how the company itself operated in order to move forward in that space, and that we need more examples of that. And attributes of governance structures. Thank you. My note. And then what were the key attributes? Everybody was going to send in what they saw was important attributes of governance structures.
Okay, for building the business case. Got it. Understood. Appreciate that. Why don't we go to Stéphane now to talk about the Accelerator Resource Hub, and then we'll have a further discussion about both these latest ideas. Stéphane?
With pleasure. So, echoing the colleagues, it was I enjoyed the group very, very much. It was quite of opinionated discussions and very, very interesting views from different colleagues. So thanks for this. And don't hesitate, anyone who was in the room, to cut me when I'm saying nonsense. I will start with almost where we end. It was towards the end. It was a very good question. That was like, okay, before thinking about acceleration, are we all agreeing that we are aiming for the same target? Because it felt like yesterday and this morning that the target could be that we want just to create more and more and more cyber organization until the end of days. And that's it. And is this real? And is this sound? So if we think acceleration, we need to frame this. And is the frame, in fact, not to go into just pumping up the number of cyber entities, but making sure that there's different models that are accelerated because they fit different needs. And here, and George helped me there because I'm pretty sure I'm going to tell this wrong, so just jump. We're thinking about trying to cluster this in 3 categories. You mentioned that yesterday. Colleagues were not everyone was there, so I'm going to try to repeat. So the first category of the type of acceleration that would be needed would be for the edge work, the exploration of there's something wrong, maybe on the horizon, we did something quick in order to go there and see what we can do about it. When you do that, you're not creating an entity, you're not creating an organization, it's a different type of funding that you need. The second is all these activities / organizations that are set up and exist because public sector or private sector are not doing what they're supposed to do. So someone steps in, creates something. Is this there to stay? It's not clear. Is not supposed, in fact, at some point to be taken over by the private sector and public sector? Maybe, but that's something different. And then the third is these philanthropies or organizations or civil society, NGOs, you name them, that are there to stay because what they do is to be done forever because no one else can do it. And if you think acceleration, you need to understand acceleration in different contexts. So we had that conversation. So if you look into this, then you can start, and we tried and we failed, trying to define acceleration. Everyone understands this very differently, but at the end of the day, we listed different flavors. So one flavor could be something should exist, which is horizontal for this kind of different topics in order to bring you to a certain maturity level for what you need. I explain. So, for example, an organization, you may need capacity to grant writing. Even sometime before grant writing, to identify what are the right grants out there. You don't even know. Or for marketing, or for storytelling. And I would argue, because that's what we do, for cybersecurity. Because a lot of organizations that are cyber, they're not cyber secure, but that's another topic. And this could be a shared service that is providing to whatever level you are, and where it's providing can be interesting in order for the common good cyber to provide advice. It could be that foundation, like big foundation, have grantees, and they would provide these shared services to all their grantees. in order to be sure that they have some sound organizational capacity in order to always be at that level. It could be that it's above the grantees. It's something that is shared above the grantees, above the foundations, that it's a common endeavor of different philanthropies, foundation, government, putting money together to be sure that this capacity exists for the larger group. So there's different flavors here. So it could be more in terms of financing your M&O. I'm not sure I understand what M&O means, like maintenance and organization, or is that this? Yeah? Management and operations. Okay, sorry about that. And so it could be something that basic, or it was mentioned that you could have the need for a fund extremely agile that accelerates your capacity to face an ongoing crisis. Like Josh was mentioning what's happening in the midst of COVID, you need to do something for healthcare. You cannot wait for decision-making of a grant of 2 years. You need to do something in 2 hours. So can we think about advocating for foundation to put a fund out there that would be like emergency, cybersecurity, something to be done fast? You know it's going to be done fast. It's not going to cost much normally, and it's not there to stay forever. And that's clear. And we're thinking then skill sets. If you're behind these funds, is this the same skill set to identify this kind of very urgent need that you need to take a fast decision? And is the same skill set to assess, 364, it was, I think, AI-generated grant application for your 2 years grant program, and you need to take a decision. That's kind of different. And all of this is part of the idea of making acceleration. So we were also thinking acceleration could be seen as shared service, mentioned that, could be seen as a unique service for a specific entity to accelerate their capabilities. Like you have, we benefited from this from the Cyberpeace Institute, for example, acceleration of our AI capability, of governance capability with Hewlett when Hewlett was funding us, so that's possible. But there was another model, which is the cohort. Like there's a lot of civil society that can put their capacity together because they know how to do something, and there can be someone funding this cohort to help someone else to be better. So you create the community, and the funding goes to creation of community to increase the capacity. So we really spend the time trying to break this down in what we would mean by acceleration, that if we would go to a money holding entity to explain to them what kind of money they need to put together in order to assess, to address what needs. And that's when you came, we were able to solve it, and you said, we need to break, and here we are.
So I will say, I did spend some time, and I'll call you, Eli, you're the first person I want to call on here for a second. But the scariest thing I heard in the last day and a half was that, I worry about threats to AI, from AI, like, attackers using it to build better malware and do better phishing and stuff. But, the lifeblood of all our organizations is fundraising. And the notion that fund-granting organizations are being deluged with applications for funding that are generated by AI, that just means the noise is going to swamp the good stuff. Yeah. And that is damn scary because it makes it hard to stand up.
If you think about this, Phil, if you're a malicious actor today and you want to DDoS the funding capacity of cyber, that's what you do. You reply to all the grants with AI. You're going to keep people busy for some months.
So I want to ask a specific question of Eli, because when we talk about the business case and when we talk about the accelerator, we're talking about trying to build capacity of the nonprofit cybersecurity sector at scale, right? Sure. And there is some experience in that, because the Hewlett Foundation specifically gave out things called organizational effectiveness grants. And moreover, had a consultant that helped organizations also increase their fundraising capacity. So love to hear from you, Eli, about what your experience was, successes, challenges in that space.
Sure, and before I answer that question, just to sort of, I love the comparative theme of like, what can cyber learn from other fields and disciplines? And so just to call out that the nonprofit starvation cycle, where inadequate funding is provided to cover core operations and expenses, is not unique to cyber. It hits all nonprofits and all sectors, and it's a huge problem. And just to also fundamentally disagree with some of the statements made yesterday about how sustainability of nonprofits isn't a concern, it's a huge concern. Every nonprofit starts with 3 to 5 people. Not all of them should continue forever. We don't need thousands of new nonprofits. But nonprofits are never gonna have a liquidity event where they're acquired, which triggers billions of dollars in payouts for those who hold, shares or options or whatever. Like, it's just a fundamentally different model. And so like, I just like have concerns about thinking about funding from that vantage point. So yes, and so timely question, Phil, and we didn't actually set this up, but actually the Hewlett Foundation is about to publish a very detailed summative evaluation about all the things that it learned over the last 10 years of funding cyber. Dozens of pages. It involves information that many of you in the room provided and tries to distill lessons learned and capture what worked and what didn't. And I think that one of the key takeaways from basically everybody who was interviewed is that more of that, what we called at Hewlett organizational effectiveness support, which is how do you get better at communications, getting better at fundraising, helping through a leadership transition, board governance, all of those basic challenges and features of a nonprofit that everybody has to do that typically get short shrift in grant applications, or a funder's like, oh, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the thing, the project, not the, it's a challenge, and that is why there's a dedicated pot of money at Hewlett solely to do that. And it validated that that was hugely impactful, and that the returns from those kinds of grants are potentially transformative, because $80,000 to overhaul a specific strategy can oftentimes bear dividends over a multi-year horizon, much more than $300,000 to do a project for 18 months and generate a report. And so we need to be able to do it all. And so just to say, like, I think next week, I was emailing back and forth with when all those documents are going to be published, but I think it's going to go live probably on Monday of next week, and so there'll be lots of data there, fully transparent, fairly shared. And I think that trying to build that into a funding model, building that into a consortium approach, and all I can say is that funders who typically have been at it longer realize the value of that kind of support more than those who are not as experienced, because it isn't necessarily intuitive to new funders that, oh, I should give you money to build your core capacity, and that will fundamentally help the project I care about, even if it helps you with everything else you do, which goes to one of the distinct aspects of cyber is, in contrast to other nonprofit fields, there are very few organizations where all they do is cyber or predominantly do cyber. And so, like, I'm on the board of Girl Security, which is an amazing organization, and IST over there, and like, cyber is a core issue they do, but there are also like meaningful other work streams that are robust and have lots of staff and dollars behind them. There are way more environmental nonprofits that all they do is the environment all day long, every day of the week, and that's the only thing they do. And so that's another thing, as cyber has evolved, it's sort of been like a piece of organizations. And so that then confuses funders who they're like, but I'm benefiting your whole organization, but I only care about a small portion of it. And again, you have to get past that and realize, no, it's actually in your interest. And that goes to the business case. And the last thing I'll say is, cyber is a horizontal. It cuts across all of society and everything that every organization does on Earth. It is also a vertical. And so some funders, the business case of this is a horizontal, systematic play. This is the substrate of society. They will get that. Many won't. And they'll say, well, how does it touch my vertical? Which could be healthcare, it could be climate, it could be whatever. Everything touches cyber. It's like making the business case that connection point. Where cyber horizontally touches their vertical, how does it make sense to them? And so you need both an overarching business case, but then you also need sort of like vertical or industry specific ones. And how does that all tie together? It's messy.
We clearly agreed that we need many business, right? Many narratives, many business cases, many.
And I would just say that, Phil paraphrased what I said this morning, which is exactly what you just said, in the sense that I think the infrastructure support, how helping with fundraising, helping with structure, helping with strategy, helping with public relations, essentially. Yeah. That is something that is, as I said this morning, not as a low-hanging fruit, but not so high that we can't do it. And as opposed to the joint fund or joint Federated Model, which I think is a longer-term play, this is something I think we can put more effort into now. I mean, I think that infrastructure support is something that would help everyone in this room. And you don't have to parse what your each mission says to do that, because that's a common goal. And I think if we can do more, and I really do appreciate what Hewlett did in that space, the more we can do that, that may be something that, and that will be part of a funding model. If you have a joint fund or something, there'll be a part of that that does that too. You shave off 5% or something to help organizations do this. But in the short term, I think that's something we could do in conjunction with building the business case.
So Josh wanted to say something.
You almost said exactly what I almost asked yesterday, which is, how much should we be
cyber event.
Multi-billion-dollar funds that are already funding something, security has an adjective, like 20% of their money, 10% of their money
Yeah.
for their sector-specific needs. Because if we're not doing both, I think we're missing
1% for cyber.
whatever, yeah, but like, are we also going to the latter, I guess?
So the
So
question from Josh is, how much should we go, not to sort of, not to do specific cyber funding, but as a larger piece, so the big funding entities, sorry, my brain is a little bit off too. How much should we go and say, your cyber is a part of what you do, and Megan said 1% for cyber. So, the big funders give a little piece of what they do, what they fund, to fund the supporting piece, I think, that Eli talked about.
Like the concrete, Robert Wood Foundation gives tons to medical and healthcare. Should we try to make the best of us, convince them that to achieve their goals, a non-zero part of that humongous fund should be cyber, not to us, but within the things they already care about per se. There are some substrate that everyone needs, like shadow server, but there are some things that we could have maybe more immediate progress and thrust by getting that aha moment in a very large established foundation.
Yeah. So translation, just quickly, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation gives a lot to medical. Is it a more worthwhile request or more, is there higher ROI in convincing it that it needs to give a chunk to cyber to help solve that problem than it is to go out and get specific cyber funding? And Megan actually said yes under her voice, so I'm going to ask her to sort of give her thoughts on that too.
I mean, several of us have had this idea for a while, right? We talked about this a couple of years ago. And it was, I think, raised as an element of the B Corp concept yesterday, or the Cyber Corp or whatever. Imagine if some of the funds that we talked about yesterday, the Global Equity Fund and the PAPFAR fund, related fund, which I can't remember the name of at the moment, if they suddenly said, okay, we're going to either ideally plus up whatever that funding amount is by 1% of the total amount per year to fund the cybersecurity services of that, to verb it, I think. So are we talking about like cyber? Is this like Google? We're going to Google it, we're going to cyber it. And can we all collectively, should we all think about getting on that soapbox or bandwagon parade too?
And just on that, I remember having a conversation with someone else from the Global Fund at one point, and they said, we're doing a lot of aid in Africa. Cybersecurity is a big issue, so we care about that. So if we can make that business case for them and others to do that, that would be great.
Let me turn to Kiersten, then we're going to go to some of the global questions.
I also think, and I think it's a little bit of repeating what's been said, but I think the value there is that the challenge that we have is that we have cyber experts trying to go into infrastructure sectors and telling them why cyber is important. They get it intuitively because it's impacting their business model, it's impacting lives, et cetera. But if you have those that are actually, in this case, in the example that Josh offered, the healthcare sector experts that are now, they are owning the engagement of cyber to do their work better. While it's nuanced, I think it's a very important flip, because as long as you're telling versus actually internalizing, there's always this barrier to entry, because it's not, you're just kind of an outsider. But if the actual entities that are the experts in the infrastructure, whether it's healthcare, whether it's on other issues, if they own that cyber piece, because now if they're allocating this percentage, then they're vested in it and they have to make it work. And so then there's a totally different level of education that happens by having the sector itself own the problem in the cyber piece. And then the cyber experts are the support, not the driver, which I think when we're cutting across to Eli's point about the horizontal, we're going to have far greater reach and impact in that regard.
Go ahead, Eli.
I think that's exactly right, that it's, Robert Wood Johnson, like every foundation, is its own beast. You can't generalize across all the big donors, whether government or philanthropic. And so who will resonate and who from the public health medical profession will convince that foundation's leadership or board to say, hey, cyber is something that maybe, like when we calculate overhead percentages to all of our grantees, we should add in 5% of the total of every grant for cyber. That's like one approach. And like Ford and MacArthur and some other funders have like done some work on that. There's then we should have dedicated money that just focuses on cyber as it pertains to our healthcare, public health things we care about, and that there are dedicated, fully focused grants on building that capacity. They're not org specific, but sort of like that vertical specific. And then there's a range of things there, but it all goes to, right, them internalizing it. Because there are a million different costs they could bake in.
Right.
The problem with every funder is, well, we are all convinced that cyber really matters, and it does. So too does climate change. So too do social inequity. So too do a whole lot of other things. And there's finite resources and finite bandwidth and attention, regardless of the funder and how much money they have. And so it's also picking and choosing who is going to be receptive and who's the messenger every time.
Yep. Good, Megan.
But you can't do those things anymore without cyber. You can't ship vaccines around the world. I mean, look at what happened with not Petya, right? Look at what happened with Colonial Pipeline. So anyways, I will not quite jump on the ransomware soapbox here, but I'm telling you that it's there and I'm getting closer to it.
I understand. So
I'll drag you away.
let's try to pull this all together, right? There's two kind of clusters here that we've talked about, right? There's the with different elements, there's the joint fundraising, joint fund piece that actually talks about bringing in dollars, whether in a federated model or a joint model, and distributing it either based on contract or with some sort of governance mechanism, right? And then there's the support model, building the business case and helping nonprofits to do their work more effectively. It sort of crosses over, again, it's a Venn diagram between the accelerator approach and the business case, where the business case is really kind of almost one element of the accelerator approach at a global one. The question then, I think we all need to talk about a little bit is, this is all doable, right? Not necessarily at the same time and not necessarily immediately, but as we're racking and stacking about thinking how we're going to move forward, how would you steer, how would you have priorities? So, Chris has suggested just minutes ago, right, that the sort of business case and accelerator stuff is slightly lower hanging fruit. Not that it's easier to do, but it's a little faster to do, right? And the joint models are conceivably, I can say they're more effective. I wouldn't say that they're more effective. They're different and fulfill a different and equally critical need, right? But they're longer. Let's have a quick discussion about thoughts people have on this. I mean, is any of this not worth pursuing? Is there a clear range that we should go after one or then the other? And we'll talk about governance next, but this is the prioritization piece. Stéphane?
Yeah, on the the interconnection between the business case and the acceleration. In fact, business case is below everything else. There's a strategic choice to be made. If you want to be in capacity to make sound business case, you need to have data. If you want to have data, you need to invest, because measuring, there's a cost to it. Give you an example on healthcare. So we work quite a lot on healthcare, and we end up with two kinds of products. One is a narrative, like a soundbite that is going to talk to emotions. And another one is a continuous activity to get data, to process data, to be sure that they're useful, because you need to demonstrate credibility. And there's a lot of investment. On the first level, you end up saying that, there's one cyber attack which impacted 0.5 people in Finland and created a permanent human harm, causing to an attempt of suicide. Boom, you have your message, and then you can ground this into something else. But if you want to go there because in your cyber mind, you want at some point to be in capacity to pitch healthcare funders, you cannot just go there. You need to build the whole pipeline to do it. So there's an investment part at some point, and that's important to have in mind.
Okay, Megan?
Coming back to I'll bring back the urgency point to this. There will be less of a need for an accelerator model if there are fewer nonprofits around. So it is a bit of the chicken and the egg and the business case question, but if there is not a larger amount of funds going to this issue, CEG, because $110 million has been spent and no one is coming back with another $110 million to put into the pot, there will be fewer of us around. So I think we need to get the money going. And at the same time, sort of second order, so if we need the business case, which goes back to the accelerator model, because you can't make the business case if you can't explain what you do, the value of it, what's in it for funders. But I think you get the fund and all of a sudden people are going to be able to say, well, this is why my project matters. This is why.
There's been an interesting underlying theme, which it doesn't sound foreign, but it's notable because we're always talking about technology. that happened yesterday and today about messaging, which is slightly different than the education and awareness piece. And so the question that I have in response, or the response that I have to your question, Phil, is, are we doing a good enough job, something Megan said just triggered this, really articulating what we're achieving and what the outcomes are? We're talking a lot about the sourcing. We need the money to do the work. This is the importance of the work. This is the problem. This is how we're going to solve the problem. But our ability to articulate and actually narrate and message what those outcomes mean and how they impact. And it's different than the measurements piece. It's different than, impact factors. But if we're talking about an all-of-nation, all-of-world approach, then we need to be accessibly messaging, when you do this, this is what happens. And there hasn't been, we talk a lot about that sourcing, but I'm curious if there would be a real value as we look at these models, if we're talking about joint funding, any of them, to be much more deliberate about how we're talking about the impact of what this work actually does. That's not a technical answer. It's not you're making your systems more resilient to this and to phishing, et cetera. But it's, what is it actually doing to engage that all-of-world approach? Because if I'm going to invest, if you're telling me I need to have personal accountability and responsibility, I need to know what that is actually the output for me as an individual. What have I done for myself and my community? And I don't mean it from a selfish perspective. I mean it from I have to understand what my role is and what that impact is. And I think we've all talked about messaging on the sort of the source side, but what is the messaging on the outcome side?
Megan and then Chris.
Sorry. Well, so I was, just to piggyback on that a bit, there really, I think I was writing down, there are two narratives. One is what's in it for the funders. There's an ability to simplify due diligence, streamline the application process, avoid having AI-generated grant funds coming through the door. And then there's the what's in it, why it matters piece of this. And so we need to really be thinking about both of those thought lines or kind of storylines as we're working through the what comes next, I think.
Chris? So I don't think it's easy, obviously, to prioritize among these 4 options or even other options. Because I think in some sense, you have to have some concurrent attention on all of them. But I would say that the business case, the narrative, which is built into both of the funding models we talked about, because we all, I think in both of our groups, we said you have to have a strong business case. It's foundational. And the infrastructure support is also built in both our models, so that's foundational, it seems to me, as well. So, and I think those are, as I said before, are more achievable in the shorter term while we create these, and I would kind of merge the 2 funding streams, even though we had them in different groups, and maybe choose among what's the best of both, rather than try to have 2 different streams going forward. And that's probably the most effective way to go about it.
I think one of the things we spent a lot of time on that, what is the single aligned statement of value, right? The purpose for the consortium alignment, whatever that looks like. And I think until we get that right, or at least 80% right, I think it's sort of hard to take the next step relative to the business case.
Sorry, Phil, I just wanted to add in one final thing. I think there's an exercise to be done about what failure looks like in this work, too.
Yep.
Thank you for that. I don't feel like we've defined at all the contours of failure, and I think that would be a really useful exercise in this, because then we could back it out and see more clearly what effective measures look like.
Go ahead, Eli.
To build off that, and I don't want to be the arrogant funder who thinks that funders are perfect, because funders fail too. And so part of this is like, where have funding models failed and what have philanthropies done that's poor? But also, not all nonprofits do great work. Not all of them succeed. And that, I think failure and acknowledging that. And then I think to the question of like how to prioritize, right? Like in my mind, somebody made the point of like, if we're talking about the current field and supporting those organizations, a focus on organizational support requires less money and can happen more quickly. But if one is thinking about like more ambitious, larger scale of growing the field, then I think like that is more that joint fund. I would make the argument that the accelerator and the business model now, in theory, if done right, will build the capacity of the current field to then advocate for itself, to then unlock the more money and do the more complicated thing of the fund and the joint fundraising. And so in my mind, there is a little bit of a sequencing that one could argue for, but need to think it through more.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to I think there's a developing consensus across here. And I'm going to sort of lay it out and say, let people shoot arrows at it, which is, all of these things are really necessary as part of the building overall capacity and furthering the field. But not everything, nothing can be done immediately in any of them. So you move forward as quickly as you can on all of them, recognizing that different things will come due at different times. But the supporting pieces and the longer running pieces all sound to me from this group as part of an overall plan, which include things like, to use Lauren's term, why things have failed so far, is important. Is that a fair statement of where we are? Any further feedback on that?
I think it's a fair statement. I'd like to hear what they say, though.
Yeah. Michael?
I mean, to my mind, when we start talking about the underlying business case, right, for the common good cyber effort, I really was thinking about it doing sort of kind of 4 things, right? One is that it outlines the goal that we're trying to achieve. This is what we were talking about, sort of that fundamental statement. It also says, what do nonprofits actually contribute to achieving that goal, right? And then the inverse of that is, and what happens if they go away, right? What bad thing happens when they go away? Because I think there's a very strong lack of understanding in many, many parts of the functions that nonprofits provide, because people think that that function is either provided by a government or one of the giant trillion-dollar corporations that exist in the IT space, right? So part of the business case has to be, and here's what here's the critical functions. We have to really hone that business case, right? Then the third piece is, and why does it matter to you? Why do you care? Because just like for recruiting members to CTA, contributing to the common good only gets me so far. There's also got to be a reason that the member companies actually join. So there's a reason why you actually want the internet to function, because if you want your services to be delivered, if you want to make money in the modern world, you want the internet to actually function. So that's what's in it for you. Yes, it also helps the common good, but you're going to help yourself. And then you also have to address the question, and then the fourth thing is, and why is a nonprofit the right way to do this? Why don't we actually just give this function to a government? Or why don't we actually commercialize it and have one of the trillion-dollar IT companies actually just do this, right? And so I think the business case in my mind has to answer all 4 of those points, and actually, and then you mix and match it for different audiences, and you emphasize different things depending on whether you're talking to the U.S. government, the Australian government, the EU, or a large, funder, or different things, or even a corporate funder that is, taking money out of their otherwise for-profit business to, assist with something.
Thanks, Michael. Shannon?
So in all of these talks, I've seen tangential connections to each of these models, and I would love to be able to think of it as maybe funding phases or funding cycles, because it ultimately starts with a business case. I mean, that's profit, nonprofit, every case. And then the accelerator, there are some of us that have been around for 10, 20 years. We don't need that support or incubation of ideas. And then you have this seed idea that would be co-fundraising and at a point that would then create this fund. Of course, then my bias would say, then we can go to certification and regulation. But I just don't think that one lives without the other. If we're thinking systems thinking, right? If we squeeze a balloon in one area, the other part of the balloon is going to come up. I've said that before. But I just think if we pull back the lens and look at it as like these are each parts of a whole, I think we'd be more successful. And a cycle that keeps going as we solve our daily job and get to go get another one because we solve the problems. It's always happening. It's always a rebirth and a regeneration. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. She just said a lot of what I was going to say. This will be shorter.
Promise?
Yes, I promise. If we add the urgency lens, and I mean the urgency lens, in IT, in our business jobs, when I'm not doing nonprofit stuff, one of the quickest ways to find out how important something is to shut it off, right? And what I'm really worried about is one of our least sexy business cases to make is, hey, we've had this shadow server stuff saving your bacon forever. You didn't know it existed and it might go away. Like, we've kind of taken it for granted. And I completely agree with the systemic look, and the 3 columns that I've been trying to introduce the last 2 days are how to have a systems look at what needs funding and what type of funding and fit for purpose help before we ask what's the right funding model. Because I think the overall system should be codified, and then we should know which types of funding are fit for purpose. But I am really concerned with the increasing disruption of U.S. critical infrastructure, that we're playing really fast and loose in the next 3-year horizon. Doesn't mean we don't do this midterm and long-term stuff, but in this next 3-year horizon, with threats to water, to food, to electrical in the winter, to hospitals, to a 10% degradation in the national capacity of healthcare where you live, we are not showing the right urgency and footing to really prioritize which things, if they fail, really bad stuff happens. And that's not sprinkling penicillin dust on all of our pet projects, because there's lots of good pet projects in cyber. It's saying which of the things that are too important to fail or to struggle. And it might be that we have to bifurcate. It might be that some of us are focused on the lifeline, resilient operations of the things everyone needs, while we're also piloting, all 4 approaches for the midterm and long-term stuff. But I just don't want us to solve something for all things cyber in perpetuity, and to end on something Rob Kanaki said that I'm going to butcher. Like, cyber really won't improve as long as it remains a charity, right? It is such an underpinning to big business, to functionings of governments, to the way the world works, for us to be doing the volunteer fireman thing, which tells me, last point, I want our default posture to be, how do we fund a system where we don't need funding for anything but a small number of exceptions, like shadow server? So the system should basically find a permanent home for anything that we spot that isn't us, and then we have a sustainable funding model for the remainder.
So one quick, while Shannon in particular was speaking, but also when Josh was speaking, those of us who've worked with Mike Brown, Admiral Mike Brown, I heard in my head plan of actions and milestones again and again and again. Although it's a rapid plan of actions and milestones. So yeah, that's kind of where my head is going in terms of, we have our guidelines here to develop that, but that's got to be a key approach here. I want to turn to sort of the...
Phil, sorry, can I just say one thing?
Sure.
To that? I'm sorry to take you off the thing. I was thinking of a strategic implementation plan was the other thought that I think would be helpful. But to your point, and even to Kiersten's point about messaging is, we thwart attacks of all different nature all of the time, not just cyber attacks. And I think most of the public isn't conscious of that day to day. And it just seems to me that we don't have a narrative around resilience. A lot of the public-facing narrative is, here's how you prevent this, but not what to do if this happens. And I think there's a role for sort of societal resilience in all of this that should be leveraged as part of the messaging, because we clearly may not be able to mobilize in the way that you're sort of envisioning or as quickly. And so what we don't also want to happen is to have a systems failure whereby we've lost the trust and confidence of everyone, which was the case after 9/11, although not as severely. And sort of, I think that should be a reflective part of this work as well.
Just as a note on that, which I think is so important in this space, for those of us that have done this, with the terrorism space to homeland security to cybersecurity, the biggest challenge is that you don't get credit for what you've prevented because nobody knows. And it's just the one event that happens that you then have the fault for. And so it's a difficult way to message, but, and I do think, resilience sort of had a heyday, and then it kind of has gone underground, and now it's emerging again as not a jargon word, but as something that actually means something. And I think that element of, again, it's that accountability and individual responsibility that can connect to you're actually achieving. Unfortunately, you just don't see what you've stopped.
So we've got about a half hour left before we break entirely. I want to flip over a little bit to the question of sort of governance overall. So let's talk about where we are right now. I gave the history lesson at the start of yesterday that began roughly a year and a half ago, and we had the planning meeting. And so lately it's been, the people I highlighted before from GCA, we sort of have been the staff support for this, the program management, the organizing and stuff like that. And then there's a secretariat function that's been a number of key players. You know, Chris has been participating, Stéphane and Cyberpeace Institute. I'm not going to go through all of them. Shadow Server, Megan and IST. You know, if we're going to have a strategic implementation plan, or we're going to have a plan of actions and milestones, or we're going to have something, you know, there's got to be an organizational structure that makes those things happen. And the options are refine what we've got and continue to improve, or do something different. And I just want to have a discussion about what that ought to look like, right? At the end of the day, because we are talking about things that are going to help some more than others, right? You know, you know, decisions are going to have to be made about what are priorities and what are not priorities. You know, we've got to, as both, you know, Chris and Lawrence said at the start, trust and transparency are the linchpins of this effort. If you don't have trust and transparency, nothing happens, right? So what are people's thoughts about what this looks like? So we've got a virtuous circle as opposed to a black helicopter circling. Anybody want to step forward? Pardon? No. No, we can help, right? You know, as you can tell from the fact of this conference, you know, I'm committed to this, my organization, and at least, you know, we've had 2 of my board members here. I hope we'll remain committed to this. We're committed to continuing to support this, but it's got to be a big tent. You know, it can't be GCA doing all this, because the black helicopters will go up. And if it's all Americans, then the Europeans are not going to do anything. And the Global South, if they're not involved, right? So we've really got to build this the right way. And I'm happy if it's the view of the community that we sort of continue to bring the group together and move forward to continue to do that. But it's, you know, we need commitments from people. We need people to participate. You know, and eventually, you know, to Eli's point, somebody's going to have to cut a $10 million check if we're going to do a joint fund. It's going to start to incentivize this. But it's got to be a group effort. This has to be a, you know, one team, one fight effort, regardless of the fact that we've got jealousies and conflicts of interest and legitimate different views about what's important and not important. Stéphane?
Yeah, interesting that you're raising this, because it's something I haven't heard too much about the past 2 days, is the word competition. And a lot of us, civil society, want competition with each other when it comes to this pot of funding, etc. So I would argue that we are here like sitting and asking, you know, for funders, this stuff that is funders to work better, to be more accurate, more agile, to fund this better, to save the world, it's fine. But then we need also to clean in front of our own doors, in the sense that if we participate to this, we participate to this seriously. When it comes to the business cases, for example, the idiotic example, we put some data out there that are public on how to measure the harm of cyber attacks. So we put a lot of effort into this. The entity that I see using this the less is civil society. So I have been contacted by startups who used our data in order to pitch to VCs money for I mean, what the heck? And, but I don't have this so much as cooperation between civil society to say, okay, you produce this, I produce that. It looks like together we have a crazy business case to go to another funder. Let's make this happen. So I would imagine that this group should also be the moment that, yes, we can agree for some of us we're in competition, there's no problem. But when we sit here, we really try working together because we believe there's something bigger to achieve. And not that we invited to a meeting, and sorry, I'm going to be blunt, but okay. Pardon my French, is that we are 2 days in a meeting, we don't say anything, but we just this for bilateral with funders. That's it.
Great. So let me just say what at least I'm going to take away from this, and again, I'll ask people to contribute, is that, you know, there's an execution plan that comes out of this, right? And I'm actually combining my closing remarks now with the panel, so we can all just talk about it, right? The execution plan is that, as I said at the start, right, the goal here, we are going to produce with oversight and input from people here, a report of the conference. The report is not the outcome of the conference. The report is a milestone to describe what was discussed and to instantiate what we've done. The outcome of the workshop is what happens now, what the next steps are, what we start to execute on. And so, my plan would be to reassemble the people who've been acting as the secretariat. And, it's a coalition of the willing, right? I don't want people coming in the room to sit and watch, but if people are going to put sweat equity in and devote energy to this and fill in either on the whole piece or a small piece, then join up. Let us know you want to work, and we'll invite you to the secretariat function, right? So we'll bring the people together that want to put in the work, and we'll continue to move forward, right? There's going to be some. There'll be an intermediate report. There's going to be some communication stuff, right? As we go forward and develop, and I'm not going to call it a strategic implementation or a plan of actions of milestones, but whatever that next step is, whatever that execution plan looks like, as approved by the secretariat function, or whatever we call that as well, right? It's going to include really doing things, continuing to communicate to keep people informed. So there is going to be a panel at RSA on Common Good Cyber and the discussion we had. That's already been approved by RSA, and I'll be moderating it. Megan's on the panel, Craig is on the panel, Camille is on the panel, and then Mike Lashley, the CISO of MasterCard, is on the panel. And we are looking towards having another broad check-in. Now, there'll be secretariat meetings and other discussions. It's not going to. If you want to be in those, let us know, right? There'll be another check-in broadly in Europe, because this is not a U.S. thing, right? I take everything Josh said about the national critical infrastructure as true, but it's a global problem, and I'm committed to solving this as a global problem, right? Next meeting is going to be in Europe, probably in The Hague in October on the borders of the One Conference. That's the hope. But it's going to be in Europe, because it's not going to be a US-only thing. And we're looking to try and get things implemented, substantially implemented by a year from now, right? Really aggressive timeline that may not be, we have a joint fund, we've got a joint fundraising, we've got a business case. But it means we have some things really done that are helping the community and moving forward by then. So that's kind of what this all looks like. Feedback, thoughts on that? All right.
Can I just add one point? I mean, I know and I suspect this is true for all the groups, there were very active people in our groups who hadn't really, they thought about the problem generally, but hadn't really thought about these solutions before. And I just echo what Phil said. If you're interested, you should, people volunteered to help with things, so now, walk the walk, help with that. I know that everyone has limited time, but that's something that I think, there was a lot of energy I think this conference generated in the last 2 days, and I think it's identified people who want to join this effort.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll need people, and by we, I'm talking about all of us and all of you. Right? We'll need people to step up. Yes, go ahead.
To answer your question, to speak for a couple people in the hallway last night and this morning, I think the great news is there's a lot of provocation and critical thinking caused by yesterday. The less great news is I don't think everyone's ready to vote as a permanent vote or have a consensus on plan of action yet. I think we have to digest a lot of what we heard. There's some really high highs and some really low lows, and it might be that we need plural efforts, but I would encourage caution or not getting ahead of the people that need to get on board. I think there's more discussions to be had. This was an excellent in-person day-and-a-half provocation, but I hope that there's time to digest, recalibrate, reframe before we go too far.
No, I agree 100%. I don't think there's anything to disagree with on that. Right? The whole point of developing a plan of action or a strategic implementation plan is you've got to, it's not somebody telling everybody else what to do. If it's a big tent effort, it's jointly developed, it's communicated, people have time to do inputs, people have time to help steer, but not a whole lot of time. A rapid development, but it's not, if it's going to be a big tent effort, it's going to be a big tent effort.
And it has to be a big tent effort.
And it has to be a big tent effort.
Right.
So I'm going to, let's see, do I see any other hands? I'm going to, that's not, sorry. Is there a hand out there? Okay.
Well, I just wanted to say it's very commendable and we should really make next steps and plans. But as for, from European perspective, Europe is fragmented, and in Europe we do not have this philanthropic culture as we have in the United States. So I think for the European strategy we need to have a maybe slightly calibrated strategy for Europe and a different strategy for the US. Mm-hmm. And in Europe we also need to work with the governments, because the usual non-profit world in Europe is depending on very much on governmental grants and governmental activities. This is just about the Europe leg of the initiative. And then another thought that we touched yesterday already briefly when we talked about examples from other fields. What about the political involvement? Well, I know in the US we do not want to talk about politics right now, but I'm just thinking in Europe, for instance, if you want to lift a topic from the ground in Brussels, then it's always a good idea to involve a couple of members of the European Parliament and then think about how we are packaging this idea, because when it's just my maybe experience dealing with cyber in Europe now for 15 years, that if it stays in this very narrow layer of experts only, then it will be never going to the next stage where we actually might have the political support plus some sort of funding coming from either different governments, or because of the politicians are involved, one of those might take it as a interesting issue to be flagging, and then we have to think about packaging, like something like keeping the free internet alive type of, a bit more slogans that are appealing to the politicians. Because if I have the feeling that if you do not involve the political layer, then probably it's harder just to lift it up from the ground. Yeah.
Completely accurate. Stéphane?
Yeah, reacting on what Ellie said, it's very accurate. You mentioned in next step, maybe something that is very low-hanging fruit is, I think, Michael, you framed it extremely well, to explain why it's such a problem and to have this piece of information that demonstrates to everyone what common good is in cyber, what is done by non-for-profit, meaning what is not done by public sector, what is not done by private sector. I'm not sure that everyone has this piece of information in a super actionable way that we can market. And to link to what Ellie was mentioning is then to who are going to pitch this, taking the best of the momentum. In the EU now, they are all busy like crazy because there's going to be the new commission. So they're all thinking for good ideas in order to pitch so that the new commissioner is going to shine because there's going to be new boss, etc. That's the moment to push this kind of narrative. Because if you go to a new commission and you explain that there's huge part of what you think is safe because of public sector, private sector, that in fact is not, because it's managed by civil society, and now you are going to rediscuss the budget for the EU for the next 5 years, maybe there's something to maneuver there. So in terms of timeline and addressing the plan, US strategy, EU strategy, I believe that the foundation is this key information about what is it that civil society is doing that is critical for the world to keep the lights on and to make a marketing product out of it that we can all of us then go into our communities and pitch.
I think that's a very good point. So couple quick comments, and then I think I'm going to go down and ask each of the panelists to give any final thoughts or sort of coda that they'd like to as we go forward. One is, this is going to continue to be an open process, so stuff will be published on the website. If you want to stay informed, it's really important for you to sign up for the double-in, opt-in emails, because we have to, we have to comply with GDPR and Canadian anti-spam laws and stuff like that, and we're not going to keep sending you emails if you haven't done a double opt-in. And so you can watch the website, but if you want to get the emails, go through the sign up. I swear we will not spam you. You won't even get one email a week, but when stuff comes out, we'll let you know about it if you do that, and you can always unsign, but please do sign up. And the second thing is watch the website. You saw, we published the read-aheads. We did get one additional contribution from an organization. We published that. And this event was on the record, right? Because it's intended to generate trust and accountability. It's not backroom discussions. It's about exposing and sharing and building the case. So do watch the website. And if you want to get involved, let us know. Certainly when we bring the Secretariat together, we'll figure out what the options are. We'll sort of move forward on that, and we'll try to keep, it is going to be a fully participatory process, and nobody's going to shove anything down your throat. But decisions are going to have to be made, and the people who are going to make those decisions are the people who are putting the sweat equity into the process. So just lay that out. So I'm going to go down and ask if there are any final thoughts or comments from each of the closing panelists here. So Megan, I'm going to start with you because you're right next to me. And then we're going to go down and we'll end with Kiersten. Go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to reiterate the thanks for pulling this together and to the team at GCA for all of the sweat equity that has been put into this. I will be brief just to say, I think, to come back to this theme, there is a real need for us to accept the urgency of what's confronting us, not only because of funding cliffs, but also because of geopolitical challenges that are going on that affect our work in a variety of ways. I think to come back to a different phrase, I don't think I said this yesterday, and I haven't actually read the entire book, but there's a book called Can't Not Do. And so I think that's, we've talked about, should we shut down a bunch of, should we all stop doing things for a day just to see what happens? If we turned off Quad 9 and Shadow Server and, stopped pushing data out, what would happen? I don't know if there would be knock-on consequences, but should we consider that? Is there a way that we can kind of turn the lights off to see if people start to recognize the, which is dangerous, but short of that, imagine if. So I think the can't not do question is also a challenge for us to be thoughtful about how it is that we're articulating our contributions and the force multiplying effect of our efforts collectively to support this idea of common good. So I have some ideas, but I promised I wouldn't get on my soapbox, so I'll save those for the wrap up.
I'm going to mangle this phrase, but it's something along the lines of when all is said and done, oftentimes more is said than is done. So maybe I didn't mangle it too badly because I'm getting nods from that side of the room. I think your comment about sense of urgency is important. I think the other comment, though, and Eli made it, and I'm not sure as clearly as we needed to hear it, which is all of those sense of urgencies that we're feeling exist in many of the other domains as well. And the noise level is going up, and we're not good at pithy. And so we've got to get better at pithy in order to break through all of that noise and make the case to the funders and to ourselves that this is the right way of taking on this common challenge and addressing it. And so if there isn't a call of action better than that.
Thank you, Chris.
So I'd say two things. One, just echo as I said earlier, people who've been active to become involved. But also I'd say, Phil, you can do some express outreach and try to find some people. They may say no, but you might as well do that. We've done that in the past. I think what I've also heard from some people, there are people who weren't here too. So we want to, there's been a lot of work that's been done. There's been mapping exercises of what different organizations do. Let's use some of that to designate and find the other people who need to be in the room. And I do think, I take the point that we shouldn't just move forward for the sake of moving forward. We have to be thoughtful about how we do it. But this has generated, I think, a fair number of good ideas. But we shouldn't also underestimate the challenge in executing any of these, because there will be a lot, given that most of the people in this room barely have the resources to do time to do their own mission. So it is a challenge getting people to volunteer. I think everyone understands this, but I think this has been tremendously helpful over the last day and a half.
Yeah, just to thank everybody in the room for the work that you and your organizations do to keep people safe. To thank Phil and the organizers for pulling it together. And I think that just echoing the sentiment of building the big tent, I think as this evolves, bringing in more organizations from the Global South, those that expressly represent and come from other diverse communities. I can think of lots of great civil society in India, for instance, and elsewhere that we should actively rope in. And then just to say, I'll make sure that all of the legacy knowledge, learnings, analysis that Hewlett publishes as part of the info data drop that's going to drop on the Hewlett website next week, I think will be relevant. And so I'll make sure to feed that in. And for those who want to geek out about summative evaluations of philanthropy, we got something for you.
Lauren?
I guess I'm going to lend you advice that my mentor shared with me. He was 90, he died during the pandemic, and he said, Lauren, risk equals reward equals tax implications. So my thought is you might want to start getting someone working on what are the legal, what are the laws and regulations around any of the entities that we're discussing, because that takes time and money and may have implications for all of this. So try not to be redundant there.
Yeah, I mean, answering your question, and I guess I understood Cole's Phil. I mean, we are committed to help put in resources into this for sure, and with pleasure. Really believe into this. Just the fact with the crowd that is over there. Again, low-hanging fruits. Let's try to make the best of what all of us is producing. Really, at minimum, there's tons of amazing data, narrative, capacity that we share. Let's look a bit at each other and try to channel this towards the common good cyber. There's data on the human harm of cyber attacks. There's data on what is happening with the malicious traffic when it comes to different sectors. All of this is there. We can really create very powerful narrative out of this.
Thank you, Phil, very much for putting this together, and thanks to everybody for the contributions. I think, we came to this discussion with a sense of the urgency of the need of what we don't have and what we need. What has been very clear to me over a day and a half of actually what we do have, the competencies, the capabilities, the skill sets, the desire, the motivations, the intentions. And I think, when you look historically, when we have these moments in history, there's always this reflection, if you go back, 2-3 decades, about there's this moment of chaos where everybody feels very desperate about what isn't working. And those tend to lead into what does work, because that chaos gets to organization. And I think what's quite clear is that we do have so much of the tools, the understanding, the need, and this desire to do better. And now we have to organize that into a place where there's a framework for the future, there's a governance toward getting to the place where we're taking all of these a la carte capabilities and how we're addressing the need, and then passing them off to the institutions or the evolution, so that we are working ourselves out of a job to what comes next. And so I am encouraged. We've talked about resilience, we've talked about the future, but I'm encouraged by what we have, because if you think about the skill set, the expertise, the decades of experience that has been represented over the last day and a half, it is a very positive implication for how we can come together. Obviously, it's action. We heard it yesterday. The worst thing you can do is not to act, and there's a lot that needs to be done. But we just have to come together to appreciate that. I do believe we have the pieces to create that success, but now we have to organize them, and again, not just domestically, but globally, and how we can build that resilient future, but more importantly, build the security and the safety that we're looking for, not just for today, but for many decades to come.
Thank you all. I do want to flag one additional thing relevant to what Chris was talking about. There are a lot of positive synergies here, right? And like one of those is the positive synergy with the GC3B work that Chris and Stéphane's organization and the World Bank and who else was led with the Accra event back at the end of November. And that's different because it's international development, but it's also cyber and sort of resource focused. So, I think the key part, go ahead.
The whole idea of that is to bring the development community and the cyber community closer together, and that is a huge untapped possible source of resources. So, that's something that continues to be worth pursuing no matter what structure we have.
Absolutely. And there are other things where there'll be synergies. I'm just going to close it out with a thank you. So what's going to come after this? We'll start generating. There's going to be a quick after action report after this, and then we'll pull the full secretariat together within the next couple of weeks to talk. And we'll work on generating a report that can come out that will, again, not be an outcome, but a signpost. And then the activity begins with the secretariat then to develop that strategic plan or plan of action and milestones. We're still going to need to do community building, but there's going to be a lot of program management and project management. To that end, I want to thank everybody here for coming and participating. I know it was a significant investment of resources. I'd also want to thank you. I assume you guys noticed this, but we had about 120 people here. About 30 of them were on the stage at one point or another. So there's a lot of people already participating. And I especially want to thank the Chertoff Group and the Cyber Threat Alliance for helping to contribute to some of the costs. It was super helpful. And I want to finally close with thanking, if you'll allow me this, my team at the GCA, I should say our team. It was, a really huge effort. We have Leslie in the room, and Leslie runs our Internet Integrity Program. Marina, who is our overall comms lead. Hi, Marina. Galia, who's one of our sort of strategy and support directors. Komal, who is our chief business officer. And then most particularly, I want to thank Kaylee Giroud, who is standing there. If you think this is a US-focused effort, Kaylee lives in Brussels, and this is really all of her doing. She was the one who made this happen. She managed the project, she provided the leadership, and so I can't thank you enough, Kaylee, for your helping us with this and leading this. So it was very, very valuable. All right. Thanks to all of you. We're going to end 5 minutes early. Feel free to stay around and talk. There's going to be some follow-on meetings. But again, thank you all. I appreciate it, and be well.